What happens when a devoted mother spends Christmas alone, forgotten by the very people she loves most? The decision she makes next sends shockwaves through her entire family. Margaret Langley always cherished December. The month held her dearest memories: crisp walks beneath twinkling lights, the cinnamon-laced warmth of her kitchen, grandchildren's laughter bouncing through her old Victorian house. For over 40 years, she'd made Christmas the center of her family's world, a haven of comfort, tradition, and love. This year, she decorated early. On the first day of Advent, Margaret wrestled the artificial tree from the attic, dusting off boxes of ornaments. She carefully unwrapped glass baubles her children had made in grade school, strings of popcorn she and her late husband, Bill, once strung together, even the faded felt angel with crooked wings. She hung each piece with a tender memory, pausing at the stockings embroidered with her children's names: Michael, Sarah, and Peter. By December 10th, the house glowed in soft gold. Margaret spent hours baking, her kitchen perfumed with gingerbread and cardamom, cooling racks crowded with sugar cookies and fruitcake. She mailed tins to neighbors and the local church, tucking handwritten notes inside: "Merry Christmas, with love, Margaret." The postman lingered for a cup of cocoa, sharing news from the neighborhood and accepting a bag of cookies for his route. Each evening, Margaret called her children, inviting them for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. "The roast will be ready at 6, she promised Michael, her eldest, now a partner at a downtown law firm. He always replied with, "We'll see, Mom. It's busy at the office." Sarah, juggling her 2 children and a teaching job, said, "We'll try, Mom, but the boys are so wound up this year." Peter, her youngest, answered only by text, quick, clipped messages that read, "Not sure. We'll let you know." Undeterred, Margaret prepared as she always had. She shopped for each child and grandchild, wrapping gifts with her trademark neat corners and silk ribbons. She embroidered new ornaments for the grandchildren, set the table with her best china, and ironed the red tablecloth Bill had given her their first Christmas together. She even polished the old silverware, humming carols as she worked. On December 22nd, Margaret received a voicemail from Michael. "Sorry, Mom, we're heading to Amy's parents in Vermont for Christmas. Flights are booked. Maybe we can get together next week." Sarah called to say the boys were coming down with colds, and Peter's reply came in a rushed call from the train: "Got tickets to Florida with friends, Mom. Maybe next year." Margaret's hands shook as she hung up the phone. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the spread of gifts and cookies, her home aglow and ready for laughter that would never come. Outside, snow began to fall, thickening the quiet. Margaret walked from room to room, turning on every twinkling light, willing the house to feel less empty. On Christmas Eve, she called Carol from across the street, inviting her for tea. Carol arrived in her red scarf, arms full of scones and gentle company. They sipped tea by the fire, watching snow collect on the windowsills, exchanging memories of Christmases past. Margaret smiled, but her eyes were glassy, her heart heavy beneath the warmth of her friend's kindness. Christmas Day dawned silent and bright. Margaret, dressed in her best sweater, set out breakfast for one, and opened her own gifts with trembling hands. The phone rang twice, once for a group video call that lasted only a few minutes, grandchildren distracted and her children hurrying the conversation along, and once for a wrong number. The rest of the day was spent in the quiet company of old carols, faded photographs, and the hush of falling snow. As dusk fell, Margaret walked through her beautifully decorated house, the silence pressing in around her. She poured a glass of wine, lit the candles on the table set for many, and made a single wish: to be remembered next year, and to remember her own worth, no matter who showed up. Boxing Day arrived with a gray sky and a chill that seeped through the window panes. Margaret woke early, habit more than necessity, and lay in bed listening to the quiet. No footsteps on the stairs, no giggles, no clatter of cereal bowls, just the faint hum of the furnace and the distant toll of the church bells marking morning mass. She turned on the radio for company, the sound of a cheerful host reading out holiday greetings that were meant for other families. Margaret set about her morning routine, making coffee and buttered toast. She ate at the kitchen table, the centerpiece of holly and pine needles still perfectly arranged. Her phone, silent all night, showed no new messages. She scrolled through old photos: Michael as a boy, Sarah holding her first doll, Peter covered in wrapping paper scraps, Bill carving the Christmas roast. Each image a soft ache. A knock at the door startled her. It was Carol, bundled in a heavy coat, cheeks red from the cold. "Thought you might want to get out for a bit," she said, holding up 2 tickets to the community matinee. Margaret hesitated, then agreed, grateful for an excuse to leave the house. They bundled up and walked the short path to the town hall, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The hall was full of neighbors, chatter echoing off the walls. Carol led Margaret to their seats, waving to familiar faces. The play, a retelling of A Christmas Carol, offered laughter and a few misty eyes. Margaret found herself clapping and smiling, caught up in the story of regret, kindness, and second chances. Afterward, they stopped for cocoa at the local cafe, where the owner, Mrs. Patel, insisted on treating them to extra pastries. Margaret accepted, cheeks pink, and listened as Carol traded gossip about neighbors' holiday adventures. Returning home, Margaret spent the afternoon writing thank-you notes, one to Carol for the company, another to Mrs. Patel for the pastries, and a third to the postman for his holiday cheer. She found comfort in these rituals, small acts of gratitude that reminded her she still had a place in the web of her community. Later, she called her neighbor's daughter, Jenna, who was home from college and sometimes helped shovel Margaret's walk. They spoke about Jenna's plans for the new year, her hopes for grad school, her worries about missing family while away. Margaret listened, offering advice and encouragement, feeling the spark of purpose that so often dimmed in the long winter months. Evening brought a light supper, leftover roast and cranberry salad, and a phone call from the church, inviting Margaret to join the committee for next month's food drive. "We'd love to have your experience," the pastor said. Margaret accepted, thinking how good it felt to be needed, even in small ways. Before bed, she took down a single ornament, a wooden dove Bill had given her on their last Christmas together. She cradled it in her palm, remembering the promise he'd whispered, "Never let anyone make you feel less than the gift you are." Tears pricked her eyes, but she set the dove gently on her nightstand, a talisman against the ache of loneliness. Margaret wrote in her journal, "Families grow apart, but kindness grows roots. I must find a way to matter, even if it's not as a mother at Christmas time." With that thought, she turned out the light, the glow from her neighbor's porch reflecting softly through her window, and let sleep come, carrying her toward the promise of a new day. Margaret's week found its own rhythm as the days slipped quietly between winter storms. Each morning, she pulled on her thick wool sweater, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and swept the porch clear of snow. The quiet neighborhood shimmered beneath a white hush. She watched children pull sleds down the hill, their laughter carrying through the cold, and waved at neighbors as they brushed off cars or walked dogs bundled in tartan jackets. On Tuesday, she visited the local grocer. Mrs. Evers, the owner, greeted her by name, pressing a bag of clementines into her hands. "For your winter vitamin C," she winked. Margaret thanked her, adding an extra loaf of bread and a wedge of brie to her basket. She lingered at the community bulletin board, reading notices for lost cats, piano lessons, and a call for volunteers at the soup kitchen. She walked home slowly, pausing at the bakery to buy fresh rolls for Carol. Back in her kitchen, she assembled a basket, clementines, bread, homemade jam, and brought it to Carol's house, where the two friends shared coffee and plans for the coming year. Carol's stories, warm and full of life, softened the edges of Margaret's disappointment. "You're a part of this town, Margie," Carol said, patting her hand. "You always have been, no matter what your children remember." The days brought more gentle connections. Margaret agreed to join the church's food drive committee and attended their first meeting on Wednesday evening. In the drafty parish hall, she sat among neighbors and friends, listening to plans for collection bins and distribution days. Someone suggested a bake sale, and all eyes turned to Margaret. Her gingerbread was legendary. She agreed, feeling needed, her heart filling as people jotted down her ideas. Later that night, she sorted through old Christmas cards, some from distant family, most from the local community. She penned new notes to elderly neighbors who rarely left their homes, offering to bring groceries or just to chat. She felt the tug of purpose return, quiet but persistent. Thursday brought Jenna, her neighbor's daughter, to shovel the walk. Margaret invited her in for hot cocoa. They sat by the kitchen window, Jenna sharing stories of college roommates, dreams of travel, fears about the future. Margaret listened deeply, offering reassurance and a listening ear. "You remind me of Sarah at your age," she said quietly. Jenna smiled, grateful for the warmth that was more than the mug in her hands. In the evenings, Margaret worked on her embroidery, tiny blue forget-me-nots on linen handkerchiefs, each stitch a meditation. She wrapped one in tissue and delivered it to Mrs. Evers, a small thank you for her kindness. She began to wonder if there were other ways to mark her gratitude, gifts and letters, memories handed forward. Sunday came, church bells ringing in the clear air. Margaret dressed carefully, pinning Bill's dove to her coat, and walked to the parish. The service was full of music and candlelight, and as she sat among neighbors, she felt less alone. Afterward, she helped serve coffee and pastries, laughing with Mrs. Patel and the choir director, sharing plans for the food drive and listening to stories from other volunteers. That night, she stood by her window, watching as a soft snow began to fall. The town, alight with lamps and Christmas still twinkling on a few porches, seemed both smaller and more intimate. Margaret wrote in her journal, "If family drifts, perhaps I can make family anew, in every kindness, every shared moment. I am still here." Sleep found her surrounded by these thoughts, warm against the cold, the ache of absence slowly being filled by new connections. By the second week of January, the sharp edge of Margaret's holiday loneliness began to round off, replaced by a new sense of belonging in the fabric of her town. Morning started with a brisk walk, her boots crunching over snow, breath steaming in the cold air. Margaret took comfort in simple rituals: coffee by the window, writing in her journal, planning her days around church meetings and volunteer work. Her calendar quickly filled. The food drive committee assigned her the task of coordinating home-baked goods for their upcoming sale. Margaret was in her element, jotting lists, calling friends for secret family recipes, and organizing a baking day at the parish hall. The kitchen buzzed with the laughter and chatter of other women, Mrs. Patel rolling dough with practiced hands, Carol mixing cinnamon into apple loaves, teenagers from the youth group filling trays with cookies. Margaret's gingerbread disappeared the fastest, with neighbors sneaking pieces off the cooling racks before they'd even cooled. One afternoon, Jenna stopped by, cheeks red from the cold, asking if Margaret could help her sew a button back onto her winter coat. Margaret welcomed her in, set out hot tea, and guided Jenna through the stitches. They talked about everything: her classes, her dreams, her hopes for the spring. Jenna asked if she could help at the bake sale, promising to recruit her roommates. "You make this house feel like home," she said, shy but sincere. Margaret's heart warmed at the words. The bake sale itself was a whirlwind. Margaret spent hours at her table, offering samples, exchanging recipes, and chatting with passers-by. She saw familiar faces from church, the grocery store, and the post office, each connection a stitch in the ever-growing quilt of her community. The sale was a success, raising more than enough for the food drive and filling the parish pantry with canned goods, fresh bread, and winter produce. Afterward, the pastor gathered the volunteers for coffee and thanks. He praised Margaret's energy and kindness, asking her to lead the next event, a Valentine's Day dinner for seniors in the community. Margaret agreed, surprised at how good it felt to be asked, to be relied upon. In the quiet evenings that followed, Margaret wrote thank-you notes to everyone who'd helped, hand-delivering them along with leftover cookies. She watched neighbors light candles in their windows, exchanging friendly waves through the glass. Carol invited her for soup and a movie, and Mrs. Patel stopped by with spiced tea and a new recipe to try. Margaret's kitchen became a hub of warmth and laughter, the ache of December receding into memory. One snowy Thursday, as she dusted the shelves in her study, Margaret came across her will, tucked inside a manila envelope marked, "For my family." She opened it, rereading the careful instructions she'd written years ago. Gifts divided evenly among her children, her jewelry promised to Sarah, Bill's books to Peter, the house to Michael. She sat for a long time at her desk, pen in hand, heart heavy with old promises and new truths. But that day, she made no changes. Instead, she closed the envelope, set it aside, and returned to her kitchen, where the kettle was boiling and a friend waited at her table. As January melted into February, Margaret's home grew lively with new rhythms. Her kitchen, once silent except for the ticking of the clock, now rang with laughter, the scrape of chairs, the clatter of teacups. The Valentine's Day dinner committee met twice a week, filling Margaret's dining room with neighbors planning menus and decorations, their coats hung in a row by the door. On Saturdays, she hosted baking afternoons for the youth group, teaching teenagers the secrets to flaky biscuits and pillowy cinnamon rolls. Jenna brought her friends, shy at first but quickly drawn in by Margaret's patient instruction and endless encouragement. Flour dusted every surface, but the mess was a joyful one. As trays cooled, the group lingered at Margaret's table, sharing stories about classes, jobs, and small heartbreaks. Margaret listened and offered advice only when asked, finding herself grateful for these borrowed grandchildren, eager for her warmth and wisdom. Outside her home, Margaret grew more involved with the church. She helped distribute food to seniors and families in need, sometimes lingering at doorsteps for a chat or a cup of tea. She became a familiar face at community events, bingo nights, book clubs, sing-alongs at the parish hall. Her circle expanded to include Mrs. Franklin, who shared stories of World War II rationing, and young Adam, who brought his mother's chili to every potluck. At the market, shopkeepers greeted Margaret by name. Mrs. Evers always tucked a little extra fruit into her bag, and the baker saved the end crust of every fresh loaf for her. One day, the postman left a card, "Thank you for your gingerbread, best delivery day all year." Margaret taped it to her refrigerator alongside hand-drawn valentines from Jenna and her friends. The Valentine's dinner came together with joyful chaos. Margaret and Carol decorated the parish hall with red streamers and bouquets of paper roses. Teenagers served plates piled high with roast chicken, potatoes, and apple pie. Margaret moved from table to table, checking on everyone, filling teacups, making sure shy newcomers were drawn into conversation. At one point, she caught herself laughing so hard with Mrs. Franklin that tears filled her eyes. When the pastor thanked Margaret for creating not just a meal, but a community, she felt a proud, aching fullness in her chest. She saw it reflected in the smiles of her neighbors, the glow of candlelight on happy faces. After the event, she walked home beneath a clear, starry sky. She paused on her porch, listening to the hush that used to weigh so heavily. Now, it felt like a gentle embrace, evidence of a day well spent. Inside, she poured a cup of tea and opened her journal. She wrote, "Tonight I realized love is not limited by blood or tradition. Family can be chosen, found in kindness and shared purpose. I am not alone." Margaret slept soundly, the warmth of connection seeping into her dreams, her table finally full. The weeks after Valentine's Day were a mix of sunlight and thaw, then biting cold that swept in suddenly, dusting the sidewalks with fresh frost. Margaret kept busy, walking to the market for early tulips, picking up library books for herself and Mrs. Franklin, and planning the next parish supper. Still, even as her days filled with the warmth of community, shadows sometimes crept in, quiet moments when her thoughts drifted back to Michael, Sarah, and Peter. On a windy Wednesday, Margaret sorted through her mail, bills, a card from Carol, a thank-you note from Adam's mother. At the bottom of the stack was an envelope with Sarah's handwriting. Her heart leapt as she opened it, scanning Sarah's careful words. "We've been busy, Mom. The boys are doing well. Tommy lost his first tooth. James is in the school play. Sorry we couldn't be there at Christmas. Maybe we'll visit in the spring." The note was polite, almost formal. No mention of Margaret's Christmas invitations, nor any apology for her loneliness. That afternoon, Margaret went for a long walk, boots crunching on brittle grass where snow had melted. She paused at the playground, watching mothers push their children on swings, listening to the high notes of laughter. Her own grandchildren's faces floated through her mind, smaller and more distant with every passing season. At home, she placed Sarah's letter in a drawer with others, a growing collection of birthday cards, Mother's Day notes, brief calls that never seemed to bridge the space between their lives. She sat in her armchair, holding a faded photograph of her children as toddlers, Bill's hand resting protectively on her shoulder. The ache of absence pressed in, sharp as ever. But the doorbell rang, pulling her back. It was Jenna, cheeks pink from the cold, holding out a plate of cookies she'd baked with her roommates. "We made too many. You have to help us eat them." Margaret laughed, accepting the plate and inviting Jenna in. They chatted over tea, the quiet broken by Jenna's stories of midterms and new friendships. As Jenna left, she hugged Margaret tightly. "You're like family to me, you know that?" The words lingered long after Jenna was gone. Later, Margaret called Carol. They spoke for an hour, sharing old jokes, remembering childhood games and stories of their parents. Carol gently asked about the children. Margaret was honest. She missed them deeply, but she was learning to let her heart grow in other directions. Before bed, Margaret wrote letters to Michael and Peter, just as she always had. She filled them with stories of her days, the success of the Valentine's dinner, the kindness of neighbors, and an invitation, no guilt, just hope, for a visit when they could. She placed the letters by the door, ready to mail in the morning. That night, Margaret reread her will, her mind returning to the envelope marked, "For my family." She wondered, for the first time, what family truly meant, and who she wanted to remember, if only in the pages of her final wishes. Sleep came slowly, thoughts mingling with the distant laughter of children and the warmth of a neighbor's embrace, hope and sorrow braided together. March arrived with a rush of warm days and unexpected snow flurries, turning Margaret's street into a patchwork of slush and crocuses. She watched the world shift from her window, finding comfort in small, familiar changes, the return of birdsong, the drip of icicles, and the laughter of neighbors sweeping salt from their stoops. Margaret threw herself into parish life. She organized a spring luncheon for the senior group, arranging tables with bright tablecloths and vases of daffodils. The event bustled with voices and good humor. Margaret led a trivia game, her knowledge of local history earning laughs and surprise from newcomers. She found herself sharing stories of her own childhood, how she and Carol once ice skated on the pond, how her father made maple syrup every March. Her eyes sparkled as she spoke, the room alive with connection. After the luncheon, Mrs. Franklin pressed a hand to Margaret's arm. "You make this place feel like home for all of us," she said. Margaret squeezed her hand in gratitude, realizing just how much the word home had shifted in her heart. Outside of church, Margaret helped Jenna with a project for her social work class, arranging interviews with seniors in the community. Margaret made introductions, joined for coffee, and listened to stories of long marriages, lost loves, and second chances. She found that even the oldest among them wanted to be remembered, to have their voices matter. At home, Margaret found herself writing in her journal more often. She reflected on the difference between being needed and being wanted, between giving out of habit and giving out of true joy. She wrote, "Family can disappoint, but the world is still full of hands to hold. My love is a gift. It shouldn't be given out of duty, but out of hope." One evening, as she watered her tulips, there was a knock at the door. Adam from church stood outside, fidgeting with a folded piece of paper. "My mom says you always know what to do," he said. His family was struggling with a recent job loss, and Adam didn't know how to help. Margaret listened, made tea, and offered both practical advice and the comfort of her listening ear. She promised to connect his mother with the food pantry and set up a meeting with the parish's job resources group. As Adam left, he hugged her, mumbling, "Thanks, Miss Margaret. You're the best." That night, Margaret reread her will. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and began drafting a new version, one that included not just her children, but those who'd shown up when she needed family the most: Jenna, Adam, Mrs. Franklin, and even Carol. She didn't finish it that night, but her heart felt lighter, her mind clearer. As she settled into bed, Margaret looked around her room, the stacks of books, the tulips, the card from the postman, her grandmother's quilt draped across her feet. It wasn't the home she once imagined, crowded with children and grandchildren at every holiday, but it was a home rich with love and laughter, and it was hers. Sleep came easily, the knowledge settling deep in her bones. She was alone, yes, but she was never truly lonely. She had built a new kind of family, and she had a new story to write. April brought with it sunlight that lingered longer in the evenings, filling Margaret's house with golden warmth. The tulips on her windowsill bloomed riotous red and yellow, and the neighborhood seemed to stretch and wake from winter's slumber. Margaret felt it in her bones too, a steady hum of possibility, a gentle ache giving way to hope. She spent mornings volunteering at the parish pantry, stocking shelves and greeting neighbors with a smile. Her afternoons were full, reading to Mrs. Franklin, sharing recipes with Jenna, helping Adam's mother fill out job applications at the kitchen table. Laughter and the clink of teacups echoed through the rooms that had once stood silent. Margaret marveled at how her home had become a haven for those who needed comfort, advice, or simply a quiet place to sit. Spring holidays approached, and the church was abuzz with preparations. Carol insisted Margaret join her for Easter supper. "It's time someone else sets the table for you," she said, hugging her tight. Margaret accepted, letting herself be fussed over for once, letting the love flow toward her instead of only away. Margaret also took time to finish revising her will. At her desk, she thought deeply about the meaning of legacy, not just in money or things, but in kindnesses planted like seeds. She left bequests to her children, as always, but with letters explaining what she hoped they'd remember. Not the money or the house, but the power of showing up, of making others feel cherished. She also added gifts to the people who become her chosen family: Jenna, for her studies and future; Adam's family, for fresh starts; Mrs. Franklin, for the neighborly warmth that helped Margaret through her loneliest winter; the parish pantry, to keep cupboards full. And to Carol, she left her grandmother's quilt, "for all the warmth you've given me when the world was cold." One evening, as dusk painted the sky lavender, Margaret hosted a small gathering at home. Carol, Jenna, Adam and his mother, Mrs. Franklin, and even the postman came. They ate homemade bread, sipped tea, and told stories. Laughter bounced off the walls. At one point, Jenna, shy but determined, raised a toast, "To Margaret, who teaches us all that family is who you show up for." After everyone left, Margaret stood at her window, watching the lights flicker on across the neighborhood. She felt no bitterness, only a quiet pride. She knew her children might never understand the winter she'd spent alone. But she hoped, in time, they'd learn the value of being present. For others, for themselves, for love. Margaret wrote in her journal one last time. "I once thought being left out meant I had nothing left to give. But love finds a way back. Always, sometimes from unexpected places. I am remembered. I am needed. And I will leave behind more than a house. I will leave behind kindness." She slipped between the cool sheets, feeling her grandmother's quilt heavy and soft over her. The house was quiet, but this time the silence was peaceful, the world outside bursting with new life. Margaret closed her eyes, finally content, her heart full with the knowledge that she had chosen her own ending, and that it was, after all, a beginning.